Yep, I'm still doing this video. Took 3 parts, but now it's done. Here we go. Several logical errors, factual errors, and errors everywhere appeared in parts 1 and part 2. Here's part 3.
More recent developments in physics and astronomy, however, resulted in cosmological views that challenged the belief in a divinely created world. The uneasy relationship between religion and scientific cosmology never ceased, and in the 20th century, religious issues even played a role in debates between rival cosmological theories. So why, then, is story, or cosmology, so important, and what does that mean for atheism? Here I will bring up a quote from Tolstoy, whom many of today's writers consider to be the greatest storyteller of all time.
Who the bleep cares? Oh, look, this guy wrote stuff that I agree with. That's nice. And? So what? Why does that matter?
Tolstoy had this to say in relation to meaning, faith, and God. Faith is a knowledge of the meaning of human life, in consequence of which man does not destroy himself but lives. Faith is the strength of life. If a man lives, he believes in something. If he did not believe that one must live for something, he would not live. If he does not see and recognize the illusory nature of the finite, he believes in the finite. If he understands the illusory nature of the finite, he must believe in the infinite. Without faith, he cannot live. And a second quote, "For man to be able to live, he must either not see the infinite, or have such an explanation of the meaning of life as will connect the finite with the infinite."
And you too can connect the finite and the infinite by getting Caught Between an Infinite Hope and a Finite Despair by Dan Green. That's me! Look at all these people that bought my book. Yes, they proudly bought my book and displayed my book. Some of them even included their faces with holding my book next to their face. That's amazing. Look at all the people that bought my book. This one guy just wrote about buying my book. Why haven't you bought my book yet?
Here, Tolstoy is saying that we must connect our particular existence with the infinite, meaning God or the universe itself. Or we must make ourselves blind to God.
And all of this is completely and wholly irrelevant. In full. So what? Somebody agrees with what you said. That doesn't make it true.
In other words, we must discern and articulate the story of the universe in such a way that we may relate our finite existence to the infinity of the universe. That is to say, we must have a functional cosmology in order to live. Failing to do so is nihilistic. But, as previously pointed out, science cannot help us with questions of meaning at all, and Nobel physicist Steven Weinberg expressed the inexorable march of scientism towards nihilism in his book, The First 3 Minutes. Quote, "The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless." Unquote.
I'd asked for citations at this point, which I did do, but the sort of citations that he decided to post are links. Lots and lots of links. Links as far as the eye can see. Now, these are not citations. Why? Because you have no idea what these links are to. Here's an example of actual citation. It tells you what the links are about. It's not that difficult to do.
This sentiment is dependent upon the assumption that any idea that will not submit to the scientific method, and hence fit Weinberg's definition of comprehensible, is false, or at least not worthy of consideration. Again, there's an implicit special pleading to exclude meaningful stories and ideas about God while allowing unproven ideas which lie within the scope of science.
Like what? What unproven ideas lie within the scope of science? Do you have any examples at all of that? No? Okay.
The error of this assumption is made clear in the example of a hypothetical murder. A scientist might observe a bullet hole in a murder victim, note that the bullet penetrated a major artery, and conclude that the victim died of loss of blood. But those facts do not in any way explain why the person was murdered, which is the most important part of the incident. What matters most in the event of a murder is the story behind it, and the meaning of the event is entirely dependent upon the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. In other words, the meaning lies in the space, or the interface between perpetrator and victim. Whether the victim had threatened the perpetrator's children or was being robbed by the perpetrator changes everything. It's the same observations at the scene, same conclusion for cause of death, but entirely different meaning.
Using this methodology, a cop has found a dead body with 2 odd markings in their neck. Blood has been drained from this poor victim. The cop ponders, should I use science or story to figure out what happened? And the cop decides, well, obviously science isn't enough to get to the bottom of this, so I'll just go with story. Well, the only sort of thing that makes 2 marks in the neck of somebody and drains their blood is a vampire. Obviously, it must be a vampire that killed this person. Yay for story! Story wins over science! 'Cause science can't investigate, I don't know, the DNA that belongs to the people involved and, figure out from fingerprints and forensic evidence who did it, and then maybe with more information and data figure out a possible motive. Nah, science couldn't figure any of that out. We need a story for that. Yes, that's why the vampire did it.
In the first case, the perpetrator is defending his children, which is a socially acceptable act.
Alright, so this analogy just doesn't work at all. We all know that it doesn't work because God is not detectable at all.
Whereas in the second case, the perpetrator is robbing the victim, which is not acceptable.
You can call this a story all you want, but it's just that, a story. Without any evidence, none of that would stand up in court, so who cares? You're spinning a tale. And do you have any data that shows it's true? Do you have any evidence that shows it's true? Then how do you know it's true without any of that? A story, on its own, is just a story.
This example merely illustrates that the scientific approach to discerning the truth about reality is incomplete.
Therefore, since it's incomplete, we have to have some other thing to complete it. That other thing is just making stuff up. Sure, why not? Make it up. Sounds good to me. I mean, we haven't considered the possibility that magic that's been used in certain tribes of ancient times might actually be real. We haven't even studied that because of our Western view of reality, which is clearly flawed. And we got to get rid of all those ideas of science that are skeptical against magic and test these ideas using lots of money to do so, because that's not a waste of time and energy. Let's find out if voodoo actually works. Yes, I want to study voodoo. Give me funding so I can do that. What? You don't want to fund me? Well, that's just because, you're anti-reality. You don't know that it doesn't work. You just assume that it doesn't work. With your Western ideas of what works. Have you considered acupuncture? Acupuncture has been around for a long time. Traditional Chinese medicine. What about that? That's helpful to some people sometimes. Under certain conditions, maybe. Completely untestable, but hey, we've got a great story. Hey, there's also this wristband that you can wear, and it helps you in all sorts of ways. Many athletes wear these sort of wristbands. And this thing protects from 5G as well. And you can plug this thing into your wall and it sends out good vibes that make you feel better as a human being. And these crystals can align your chakras and whatever other bullshit you want to try to sell. How about no?
And that the results of science must be interpreted further in order to be meaningful to humanity. Let's also look at the example of a cell phone, which is only possible by interpreting abstract scientific results to make a physical object.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that you don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
Furthermore, it exists only because of the human desire to communicate with one another. And what do we communicate? Stories. Science itself has little or nothing to say about how its results are used. And in denying all concepts of God, the atheist, like the scientist in the example of murder, denies the importance of interpreting the meaning behind the observed facts.
No, not even close. You're assuming that you're correct about atheists in general, which you've been doing this entire video, which is why your video is nothing but a massive straw man. I myself did not use the scientific method to determine that God does not exist. When it comes to whatever God is, science cannot study God. Those that claim that there is a God have clarified that science is unable to do that because the sort of thing that God is not a thing that can be studied by science. How the bleep they know that is beyond me. Nonetheless, you assume and assert that your straw man construct of atheists using science as a methodology to discover that there isn't a God is the reason why people don't believe in God. There's plenty of people that don't believe in God because they've never heard of God, they weren't taught about God, or they simply don't find any reason to believe in God, and the stories about God aren't good enough for them. If there is a God, they don't see that God in any observable, empirical, testable way. You can tell all the stories you want, but you still won't convince them. You don't have evidence, and that's what they want. To say that's just scientific in nature, well, you can say that, but you're ignoring their story. Why not listen to their story? Well, because that would ruin your entire ideas and make your video completely and utterly a waste of time, which it is. But but if you actually, so don't listen to them. Just pretend that you know about all atheists and why they are an atheist. That's the way to go about it. Yeah. Whatever. Anyways.
Scientists are very comfortable with ideas that seem entirely impossible in normal life. In fact, much of physics hinges upon the use of near mystical entities. Virtual particles are real when their effects are observable, but not real when they aren't useful in calculations.
And once again, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about.
Even terms that we take for granted, like particle, are not so easily nailed down. For example, a detailed article in Quanta magazine titled, "What is a Particle?" summarized the scientific understanding of fundamental particles to conclude that, quote, "we don't know," unquote.
The amount of article that you have to ignore to get to the cherry-picked quote that he uses is insanely massive. Just take a look at the article. Oh my word. Link in description.
Looked at another way, the search for the now not so indivisible atomos proposed by Democritus more than 2,400 years ago led to the discovery of quarks, which are thought of as point-like entities with zero size according to quantum chromodynamics. In other words, our search for the fundamental building blocks of the universe, the so-called indivisible atomos, has revealed that they are mysterious entities with no size.
Okay, I believe that the limb that I'm on now is actually a pretty solid branch, and I think that I need to say this one final time. You don't know what the fuck you're talking about!
It's almost as if they don't exist, and yet they do. That's mystical stuff.
I'm no scientist, so I can't explain exactly how wrong you are about everything that you said is. I just know that it's wrong because I've listened to real scientists actually explain many of these things. And although there are certain things we don't know about for sure or don't know in full detail, your idea of what these things are to be mystical is vastly mistaken. Reality is insanely complicated and very strange. True. To call it mystical, I mean, if you really have to do that, I guess you can. I don't feel any need for that word, but reality is amazing enough without adding more mystical things to it. The particles and bits that things are made out of are quite amazing. But that doesn't mean that God did it. At no point do we need to invoke God to explain any of it. All you're doing is saying, we don't know, therefore God might be a thing. Yes, just look, we don't really know how any of this works. Therefore God's hiding. It's God behind it. That's what you're doing. That's all you're doing.
Even more so for virtual particles which only exist while their effect on, quote, real particles is measurable. And all of this is before we contemplate the nature of energy and forces, the existence of which is no less mysterious simply because they can be described by a mathematical equation. Suffice it to say that atheists are more than willing to accept mystical ideas.
You're the one calling them mystical, not I. But for every single thing that you talked about, we have some way to verify those things. We know a lot about them. Maybe we don't know everything about them, but we know a lot. And the models that we come up with show results in reality. We can test them in various different ways. We can show that they're true in various different ways. And we can use them to make various different predictions that come to be true. You cannot test anything at all in regards to whatever God is. So this is not analogous to God. You're the one claiming that it's mystical, and I know that you view it as mystical, but that doesn't make it actually mystical. Mysterious and wondrous, perhaps, but it's still reality. If we could find God in this way, then great, God would be scientifically explorable. But whatever God is not apparently a thing that is scientifically explorable. Here comes the part where you claim that science is a god.
But only when they fall within the purview of their own God, science. It's important to point out here that science does not explain the universe. It models the universe and expresses that model in the form of theories and equations.
It doesn't explain it, it just explains it. With models and theories. That's not an explanation, because those are different words. I don't know how words work. Whee!
Only stories explain things, which is their role in human affairs. In fact, the entire edifice of science can be understood as a sophisticated form of map or model making.
Story's the only thing that explains things. Science is also a story that explains things, but it doesn't explain everything. So it's not a good enough story. Therefore, we need other stories like God. That's a story too. Ha ha! Checkmate!
In the broadest sense, A map is something that describes a territory. It can be used to orient oneself in the world, make predictions such as, if I drive west for 2 kilometers and turn right, I will find a coffee shop. It can perform calculations such as the distance between New York to Paris and much more. And that is exactly what scientific theories do for us. They are maps that we project onto the universe. But maps and theories can never do anything more than describe reality.
So it's a story that just describes stuff. Oh no, how terrible.
The map won't tell us whether we will want or like coffee.
It's funny you should bring that up because actually there is a way to scientifically test whether or not you would or would not like coffee. It's complicated, but we could do it.
And though it may help us get to Paris, we have to put the map away in order to explore and understand the reality of Paris and a lover who happens to live there.
Yeah, but there's still the reality of Paris from which we made the map by. And you found a lover in Paris? What? What's that got to do with the map? What the bleep are you talking about?
It is the denial of this shortcoming of science that enables the dismissal of ideas that fall out of reach of its power. Scientism insists that the results of science represent the sum total of what can be known.
And this is the ginormous construct straw man that you've been going off on the whole time. You assert that atheists use scientism to conclude that there's no God, and that's just not true. I don't conclude that there's no God. I conclude certain gods don't exist, other gods I don't know about, and what you got? What's your argument for it? So far you haven't made any case for it. So what? So that's it. Your straw man construct doesn't work, and I'm waiting for what your story is to try to convince me that there's a God. Obviously, you don't have evidence for God, because if you did, then that would fall under the preview of science, and then you could just display that evidence. So you've got to have one heck of a story that's really compelling. But even if you did have that story, wouldn't it need to be valid and sound in terms of logic to convince somebody that it's correct? And if it wasn't, shouldn't we then hold the conclusion in judgment until you have some reason that would compel us to think that the story is legitimate? The thing is, you don't have any evidence. You've pretty much admitted that. There's no way to test it. You've pretty much admitted that. And your argument, because it relies on a straw man, doesn't convince me of anything. Somebody posted on your comments, all you have to do is prove God, then there won't be atheists, or at least there won't be the sort of atheists that are around now. You haven't done anything to even come close to that. And that's not the point of your video. The point of your video is just show that atheism is wrong. But you can't do that because you don't know what the bleep atheism is.
But, as in the example of a murder above, it may only be the beginning of the story. Scientists have even searched for the human soul in the past by measuring the weight of a body before and after death. They found no change and concluded that there was no evidence of a soul. Fair enough. But if in thought experiment we were to take apart a human being organ by organ, cell by cell, searching for the soul, we would still not find it. And this is the sort of argument used by atheists to claim that the soul, being a religious term associated with ideas about God, is not real, though they are comfortable with equally vague and poorly understood terms like consciousness, virtual particle, and the idea that quarks have zero size. Again, atheists apply different standards when dealing with ideas within science.
No, it's the same exact standard. You see, for something to be scientific, it has to be something testable. The soul, apparently, is not testable. Whatever it is, we can't find it. I don't even know how we would look for it in the first place. What is it exactly? What is it made out of? How does it function? Where is it located? Who knows? You have the burden to explain what it is and or demonstrably demonstrate that it is a thing in the first place. Virtual particles, consciousness, etc. are all things that we can talk about in coherent ways because we have ways to demonstrate that those are things. The soul is not like that. So, same standard, there's no way to show that a soul is. There is a way to show that the other things are. Whoops.
Humanity can be described thus. At the center of a human being, there exists another virtual particle that we can call its story.
You know, I'm beginning to think this isn't a branch that I'm on, but it's actually solid ground. When I step out onto the ground and just say, I don't think you know what the fuck you're talking about.
And we know that it exists by virtue of its effect on the, quote, real particles with which it interacts. And this is the same standard applied within science for the existence of virtual particles.
Alright, so after much thought, I've concluded that you don't know what the fuck you're talking about!
There also exists another particle, a particle of meaning, which is made clear by those stories. And though this particle has zero size, it is every bit as real as a quark, which also has zero size, but its existence is not detectable by the methods of science.
And
we might call that particle a soul.
Cool story, bro. Needs more dragons.
The life of a human being is so short on a universal scale that it might well be thought of as a virtual particle that separates briefly from a larger object before it returns to its place of birth.
And now it's time for Deconverted Man Loses It! Oh, there once was a man named Steve who had no idea what the fuck he was talking about. Oh yeah, he had no idea what he was saying. He just kept on saying a bunch of stuff, but in reality he did not know what the fuck he was talking about. That's right, not even a little. Not even a tiny bit. The song is really crap, but so is this video. What about that? If you don't comment, I'll get upset, but you will do it. How about that? And now, back to the video!
This particle, which we have named the soul, carries the meaning of the universe while it lives, and disappears back into the universal soul from whence it came after its purpose has been fulfilled.
That's nice. Too bad you don't have any evidence for any of that.
Like a drop of water finds its way back to the ocean after falling to earth as rain and fulfilling its role in making all of life possible.
And much like water, your entire presentation is all washed up.
Let me relate this idea to Tolstoy's insight.
Oh God, no, please, no!
The soul of a person, like a drop of water, separates from the universal soul and connects the finite with the infinite by carrying the meaning of a person's life within the larger story of the universe, thus making his life possible.
So the soul story is from the universe, and then the universe gave the soul, which is a story that then told the soul to make a story about the story of the soul, and then that's what gave life to people, but also, I guess, everything else is alive. And then when they fulfill their purpose, i.e., die, then they are done telling that story, so they rejoin the universe's story. The universe also then has a story that it's telling, and that story, of course, as we know, requires a storyteller, and that storyteller would then be God. But God doesn't need a storyteller because God is the storyteller. And as you know, the storyteller doesn't need a teller of its story. It's always been the story that's always being told. And that's the story that we're going with. Great story. Too bad it's all made up.
To wrap this up with respect to atheism, first, we have the circular reasoning that concepts of God must meet the standards of proof defined by the scientific method, which was deliberately designed to exclude questions about God or meaning.
Well, that's just not true at all. The scientific method was not deliberately designed to exclude questions about God or meaning. It wasn't deliberately designed for any of that at all. Not even a little. In fact, many of the first scientists were Christian. So, what? They deliberately designed a methodology that would exclude God? I don't think so. Actually, this is completely ass backwards. It's God that is said to be outside of the purviews of science. It's untestable, unverifiable, etc. So, it's not that science was designed to not be able to detect God, it's that God has been designed to be undetectable by science.
Next, by denying the existence of all gods, atheists presume to have considered and disproven all concepts of God.
This is another construct straw man. It's not true by and large. There might be a atheist out there that does that, but I don't know who that is. What gods are there to deny? See, that implies that there is a god or gods to deny. Rather, it's saying, I don't believe in this God. I don't believe in gods. What even does the word God mean? Now, in atheism, the concept of God is said to be so incoherent, so ill-defined, that everyone is wrong in regards to God. That theists and atheists are both wrong to talk even about God because the word is so ill-conceived and incoherent. So if atheism is correct, then there is nothing to even talk about. There's nothing to affirm or deny because there isn't even anything to say in the first place. Now, I consider myself kind of a partial atheist. I agree that the concept of God is ill-defined, but I disagree that therefore that means that theists and atheists can't talk about God, because some versions of God are defined. Although I find no evidence for any God as yet. But the same could be said about just anything that you want to assert that exists. Oh, you don't think that there's leprechauns? Well, you haven't considered all the different versions of leprechauns that might exist. That's just silly. All we need is a proof of a God, whatever that is, and we would believe that it exists. We don't have any. That's why we say there's no God, because there's no evidence for God. We don't even know what God is most of the time. And the fact that there's lots of God concepts out there means that people have made up different concepts. And isn't it odd that God, if it's a thing, doesn't seem to be able to correct us humans and tell us which God is the correct God? Any concept of God that requires you to deny reality is a concept of God that must be denied. Any God that performs logical fallacies is an illogical God and not a perfect being. And if it's required to be a perfect being to be God, then it does not exist. God that is outside space-time has no where and no when to exist. A God outside of reality is not real by virtue of being outside of reality. So many concepts of God can be denied, but not all. Well, who cares? I can only talk about the ones I know about. The ones I don't know about, I don't believe in because, well, I don't know about them. But you think that atheism means there is no God, period. Which it doesn't mean that. And that's been demonstrably demonstrated multiple times, but you don't seem to care.
Which is an impossible task. Finally, atheism relies upon the logical fallacy of special pleading, when it happily considers unproven theories, mystical ideas, undefined particles, and even multiverses.
This is just one big straw man. No, it isn't special pleading, because we don't consider unproven theories, broadly speaking. I don't know what you're talking about. You have no example. Mystical ideas? Nope. I don't. In fact, earlier in the video, around part 1 or part 2, I forget now which, but you had complained that atheism goes too far in denying the spiritual, which would include the mystical. So we can't accept mystical and also deny the mystical. You're the one that put the idea of mystical in here. No atheist did that. That's you. Undefined particles, I have no idea what you're talking about. Neither do you. If they are within the purview of science, then they're in the purview of science. If not, then no. And it's disconnected from atheism. I accept whatever's in science. If there's these particles that are undefined or whatever, and that's something scientific, great. I accept that that's a thing because it's something that has been tested and demonstrably demonstrated to be a thing in some way, shape, or form. As far as multiverse, that has been put out there by some scientists, but are all those scientists atheists? No, not necessarily. And I don't know if that idea is true or not true because it has not yet been codified into science. As far as God goes, God, as you said earlier, is not within science. So that's not special pleading. But you're pretending that science was deliberately designed to keep God out, which isn't the case. If God is testable or demonstratable in any way, if it can be put into a model, if it can be used to test some hypothesis, if it can be made into a theory, if you can write about it and get that peer-reviewed by other scientists, then God would be scientific. It's not special pleading. You don't know what the bleep you're talking about.
If they fall within the purview of science, but then categorically rejects all concepts of God by implying that these ideas are differently unproven in some unspecified way.
No, they're unproven by science. Until somebody comes along and says, here's a God idea that is proven by science, whatever that is. No one has done that. So, you got nothing.
To further drive home my point in this essay, I have demonstrated that we can propose descriptions of soul and spirit, which are distinctly religious ideas, that meet the same criteria for existence as some scientifically recognized particles, like quarks and virtual particles.
No, you haven't. And if you really think you have, put it into a paper, and get it peer reviewed in some scientific publication. Let's see you do it. Let's see where that goes. Go ahead. I'll wait. Oh, what, you're not going to do that? Wonder why.
A soul may have zero size, like a quark, but its existence as the carrier of meaning is evidenced by its effect on the world around it.
That's utterly ridiculous. And wait, what was that you said about quarks again?
Soul may have zero size, like a quark.
Zero size, you say? Are you sure about that?
Zero size, like a quark. Zero size, like a quark. And though the story carried by the spirit may disappear as quickly as it arose, it is as real as any virtual particle, also as evidenced by its impact on the world around it.
Well, that's your story, but you still don't have any evidence for it.
In fact, the noosphere, which is described as the planetary sphere of reason, and popularized by philosopher Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and biogeochemist Vladimir Vernadsky, has even been referred to as a, quote, sphere of the spirit, unquote. So not only is atheism untenable, but it is also inherently nihilistic, as suggested by Tolstoy and made clear by Weinberg. And as such, it is possibly the worst of all faiths.
And there's that too cute way to wrap things up. Well, Steve, at no point did you present any empirical evidence or repeatable test or a valid and sound argument. You did present a lot of incoherent things, but I gotta admit, this last bit, I kind of look forward to it.
In future videos, I am going to explain why the story of the universe is best understood as the story of God being born, rather than as the story of God's creation.
Another story about another type of God that Steve's going to make up, because the already made up gods are boring. So Steve needs to make up a new god that better explains the universe than all the other gods, making Steve's god the best god ever, because his god will be the best explanation of all time, because that story will be the better story about God. So if you just make up a better story than that, then that god becomes real, because that's how things work now, I guess. Cool story, bro. Needs more dragons. Well, you can keep your story and your faith. I just want facts. And as long as you have faith, and I have facts, you will always be wrong. And I will always, always be right. You know, it just occurred to me, I said fuck a lot in this video, but then, at the end, I said bleep instead of fuck. What the bleep is up with that fuck?